Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let the world grow quiet, and let me tell you a story so old that it lies beneath every other story we know. The story of civilization does not begin with the pharaohs of Egypt, nor with the marble of Greece, nor with the roads of Rome. It begins here, in the dust, on a wide and wind-blown plain between two rivers. It begins with mud, and with reeds bent low by the wind, and with a handful of people who, thousands of years before the birth of Rome, looked out at an empty floodplain and decided, against all reason, to stay. They had no name for what they were building. They did not know that they were first. They knew only the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the dark, soft soil the waters left behind when the floods drew back. Out of that mud they would raise the first cities the world had ever seen. Walls of brick. Towers that climbed step by step toward the sky. Narrow streets crowded, for the first time in history, with thousands of strangers. Here, one evening long forgotten, someone pressed the tip of a cut reed into wet clay and made a mark that was not a picture, but a word. Here, in this quiet place, writing itself was born. Here a king would one day carve his laws into black stone and stand them up in the open air, so that the weak might not be devoured by the strong. Here, for the first time, justice was written down for all to see. And here the world's first great poem was told, of a king named Gilgamesh, who could not bear the thought of dying, and journeyed to the very edge of the world to escape it, and failed gently, as in the end we all must. The ancients called this land simply the country between the rivers. We know it by a Greek word that means the same thing, Mesopotamia. And tonight, we will walk slowly through the whole of its long life, from its first mud brick hut to its last silent king. We will watch cities rise and burn and rise again from their own ashes. We will meet conquerors and lawgivers, priests and scribes and slaves, and the patient farmers in the fields whose quiet labor fed them all. It is a story of 3,000 years and more, so long that the empires we think of as ancient would themselves have called Mesopotamia unimaginably old. It is, in a way, the oldest memory that humanity still keeps. There is no need to hurry through any of it. This is a story made for the soft edge of sleep. If it brings you comfort, you might subscribe and let a new story come to you each night, but only if it truly helps you rest. There is no need otherwise. And before we begin, tell me if you like, in the comments, where are you listening from tonight and what is the hour where you are? There is a quiet comfort in knowing that, all across the world, others are drifting off into the dark beside you. Now let the lights grow dim. Let your shoulders grow heavy and your breathing slow. There is nothing you need to do now but rest and listen and let the long years carry you gently backward. Back past every city you have ever known, back past every map, to a warm and shallow sea, and a low coast of endless reeds, where the two great rivers pour themselves out into the Gulf, and the world is still very young. The sun hangs low and golden. The water lies almost perfectly still. And far off on the marshy bank, half hidden among the reeds, a single thin line of smoke rises from the very first village. That is where we are going. Let us begin. Let the years carry you gently backward, past every empire and every king, to a wide and level land in the heart of the world. Two great rivers cross it, the Tigris to the east and the Euphrates to the west, and between them lies a plain that will one day be called Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Here the earth is flat and open, and the sky is very large. This is where our story begins. The rivers are born far to the north, in the cold mountains of what we now call Turkey. From there they run down for hundreds of miles, gathering the melted snow of high places, carrying it south toward the warm sea we call the Persian Gulf. Along the way they cut through the dry land like two long threads of silver. Without them, nothing here could live. The land they cross is a strange and difficult gift. In the south, the ground is soft and low. Made of mud the rivers have laid down over ages beyond counting. There is little stone here, and almost no trees worth the name. There is only the earth, the water, and the reeds that grow thick along the banks. Each spring, when the snows melt in the far mountains, the rivers swell and rise. They spill over their banks and spread across the plain, drowning the fields under a sheet of brown water. When at last the flood draws back, it leaves behind a thin layer of fresh silt, dark and rich, ready for anything a seed might become. The flood is destroyer and giver in the same breath. But the flood does not keep a calendar. It comes when the mountains decide, not when the farmer wishes, and it comes too late in the year to help the young grain. Some years it is gentle. Some years it rises in fury and sweeps away the huts and the animals and the careful work of many hands. To live here is to live beside something powerful that cannot be trusted and cannot be refused. And when the flood is gone, the other trouble comes. The summer sun climbs high and merciless, and for months no rain falls at all. The ground bakes and cracks. The heat shimmers over the plain, and the far edges of the world seem to melt into the sky. Between the drowning and the drought, this is a land of hard extremes. In the deep south, where the rivers slow and near the sea, the water spreads into vast marshes. Here the reeds grow taller than a man, whispering in the wind, and the still channels wind between islands of floating green. Ducks and fish and wild boar move through the shallows. It is a quiet, half-hidden world of water and sky, and people will learn to live within it, gathering reeds and setting nets. So why would anyone choose to stay in such a place, caught between flood and fire? Because beneath the difficulty lay a promise. That mud, when watered and coaxed and worked, could grow grain in astonishing abundance, more than any family could eat alone. The very hardness of the land held the seed of something new. For here was the great bargain of Mesopotamia. If people could learn to guide the water, to carry it where they wished and hold it back when they must, the plain would feed them richly. That single idea, water led by human hands, would slowly change everything. But that lay far ahead. First, people had to learn to plant at all. Travel back now to a time nearly 10,000 years distant, long before cities, before kings, before writing of any kind. In these years, in the hills and valleys around the Great Plain, something quiet and enormous is beginning. People who once wandered to gather their food are learning to make it stay. They are learning to farm. For countless ages, humans had lived by walking. They followed the wild herds and the ripening plants, taking what the seasons offered, carrying little, settling nowhere for long. It was a life of movement and knowing, of reading the land like a familiar face. But slowly, in these hills, a different way took root. Someone noticed that the seeds of wild grasses, dropped near a camp, would sprout the following year. Someone kept the best of them and planted them on purpose and waited. Wild wheat and barley, gathered for generations, began to be sown by human hands. It was the smallest of acts, a few seeds pressed into the earth, and it would remake the whole world. With the plants came the animals. Wild sheep and goats, followed and fed and gentled over many lifetimes, grew tame and stayed near the camps. They gave milk and wool and meat that did not have to be chased. Now a family could keep its food alive beside its home, a small flock resting in the evening shade. To farm is to make a choice that binds you. A field must be tended through the whole slow turning of the year, watched over, weeded, guarded, and harvested at exactly the right moment. You cannot plant in spring and wander off. And so the wanderers became stayers, building homes of mud and reed, laying down the first small villages of packed earth. These first villages were humble things, a cluster of round huts, a few storage pits, a scattering of hearths. But settling down changed people in ways they could not have foreseen. Grain could be stored against a hungry season, so more children lived. Possessions gathered that could not easily be carried. Life grew heavier, richer, and far more rooted to a single patch of ground. In time, the farmers learned to shape clay with fire. They pressed wet earth into bowls and jars, and baked them hard in the flames, and made vessels that could hold grain and water and oil. At places we now call Samara and Halaf, potters painted their wares with careful patterns, dark spirals, and running lines. These are among the loveliest things the early world has left us. And at Samara, on the edge of the drier land, farmers took the boldest step of all. They cut small channels from the river to lead water out to fields that the flood alone would never reach. These first modest ditches were the ancestors of every canal that would ever cross the plain. With them, people began very gently to command the water. Yet farming was always a gamble. A single bad year, a failed rain, a flood come wrong, could empty the storage pits and bring real hunger. The settled life gave much, but it also took away the freedom to simply walk toward better ground. Everything now depended on this soil, this water, this narrow band of hope. And still, generation by generation, people chose to stay. Now come forward to a time some 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, into the age we call the Akkad, named for a low mound in the southern plain where its traces were first found. In these long centuries, people at last moved down onto the flat delta lands near the river's end. It was harder country, hot and wet and wild, but it was also astonishingly fertile. Here the villages began to grow. The Akkad farmers spread their canals wider and dug them deeper, until networks of little channels laced the fields together. With water led exactly where they wished, the harvests swelled beyond what any single household needed. For the first time, a village could grow more grain than it could eat, and that surplus, quiet and unremarkable, was the seed of everything that followed. When there is more food than mouths, a strange new freedom appears. Not everyone must bend over the fields from dawn to dusk. A few hands can be spared for other work, and skills begin to deepen. The village slowly divides its labor, and some people become known for what they alone do well. So the first specialists appear. Here is the potter who no longer farms but shapes clay all day at the wheel, turning out bowls by the score, smooth and quick and alike. His pots are plainer than the painted halaf wares, but there are many more of them, made for a growing people. The work of the hands is starting to divide. At the heart of each village now stands something new and quietly powerful, a small temple raised on a low platform of mud brick. It is not large, only a single room with an altar and an offering table, but it stands above the ordinary houses, lifted a little closer to the heavens. Around it, the life of the village begins to gather and turn. The temple is more than a house of prayer. Into its storerooms flows a share of the harvest, grain given to the god and kept against lean times, a village granary watched over by holy hands. Here the surplus is gathered, counted, and given out again. The temple becomes the storehouse of the whole community, and the place where its wealth is held in common. And so a new figure rises beside the potter and the farmer, the priest. It is he who tends the god, who receives the offerings, who decides how the stored grain shall be shared when the fields fail. In watching over the god's storehouse, he comes to watch over the village itself. Without any crown or army, a quiet authority is being born. The villages themselves grow larger, some swelling towards small towns of many hundreds of souls. Houses of mud brick line rough lanes, packed close together, rebuilt again and again on the rubble of the old. Generation after generation lives and dies on the very same spot, until the mounds of their ruins rise slowly out of the flat plain, telling of long, patient settlement. By the close of the Akkad age, all the quiet pieces are in place. There is surplus grain and the leisure it buys. There are potters and priests and headmen, and temples that gather and give. There are canals leading water across the fields, and towns large enough to need managing. The plain is holding its breath. Something vast is about to be born from it. Now we come to a moment unlike any before it, in the years around 5,000 years ago, on the banks of the Euphrates in the southern plain. Here a great town has been swelling, drawing people in from the villages all around, until it becomes something the world has never seen. Its name is Uruk, and it is the first true city on earth. Try to imagine it, tens of thousands of people gathered in one place, more than had ever lived together before. The mud brick houses spread out farther than the eye can follow, packed along winding lanes and open squares. Where once a person knew every face in their village, now the streets are full of strangers. This alone is a new kind of human experience. A city so large cannot feed or govern itself by habit and kinship alone. It needs order and a center, and some power great enough to hold the many thousands together. In Uruk, that power is the temple, and the great heart of the city is a sacred district raised above the rooftops, the precinct we now call the Yana. The Yana is the house of the goddess Inanna, the fierce and radiant lady of love and war, of the morning and evening star. Here her temples rise on tall platforms of brick, their walls decorated with thousands of colored clay cones pressed into patterns that shimmer in the sun. Nothing so grand had ever been built by human hands. To stand before it must have felt like standing at the center of the world. The temple is far more than a place of worship. It is the great storehouse and the beating heart of the whole city's life. Into its courts flows the grain of the fields, the wool of the flocks, the fish and dates and oil of the land, all gathered, weighed, and recorded. From here it is given out again to feed the workers, the weavers, the builders. The temple holds the city together the way a hearth holds a home. Around the temple swarms every kind of labor. There are farmers still, of course, but also potters and weavers, metalworkers and brickmakers, merchants and boatmen and porters. Great teams of weavers, many of them women, spin and work the wool into cloth that Uruk trades far and wide. The city hums with 1,000 tasks, each one a small thread in an enormous cloth. To feed so many, the canals must reach farther than ever, and the water must be led with real skill across the fields. Whole gangs of workers dig and clear the channels, and someone must plan the work and count the harvest and store it safely. Managing a city is itself a vast labor, and out of that labor a new kind of order is quietly growing. Uruk reaches out across the land. Its traders travel far up the rivers and beyond, carrying cloth and returning with the things the plain lacks, timber and stone and copper and precious blue lapis from distant mountains. Its ways of building and counting spread outward to other towns, so that the whole region begins to move to Uruk's rhythm. A single city is remaking the world around it. And around this greatest of cities, at last, a wall is raised. A long rampart of brick encircles Uruk, marking the line between the ordered world within and the open plain without. Later legend would remember that wall as the proud work of a king named Gilgamesh, who bids strangers admire its shining brick. Within it, the city holds its many thousands, safe and gathered. So the first city stands complete, vast and humming beneath the southern sun, its temple towers catching the last of the evening light. Never before had so many lives been woven so tightly together. But this great gathering brought a new and pressing need. With so much grain to count, so many workers to feed, so many promises to keep, the human memory could no longer hold it all. Long before there was writing, there was counting, and the need to remember who owed what. In the storerooms of the temple, this could not be trusted to memory alone. So the people of the plain found a simple, clever answer. They made small tokens of clay, each little shape standing for a thing, a cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for another, a disc for a sheep. When goods were traded or given to the temple, the matching tokens changed hands, a small handful of clay standing in for the sacks and the flocks. To keep a record safe, the tokens might be sealed inside a hollow ball of clay, a rounded envelope that held the count within. Break it open, and there was the tally exactly as agreed. It was memory made solid, small enough to hold in the palm. But a sealed ball of clay had a problem, for no one could read it without breaking it open and destroying the record. So someone thought to press the tokens into the soft surface first, leaving their shapes stamped upon the outside before sealing them within. Now the count could be seen without breaking the seal. And here, quietly, a great door begins to open. For if the marks on the outside told the whole story, then the tokens sealed inside were no longer needed at all. Why not simply press the shapes into a flat tablet of clay and keep the marks alone? So the tokens fell away, and their impressions remained, and people began to draw the signs directly with a pointed reed. Writing was being born, not for poetry or prayer, but to count grain and remember debts. The earliest tablets are lists, plain and practical, so many measures of barley, so many head of cattle, the name of a temple, the mark of an official. Beside the numbers, little pictures stood for things, a stylized ear of grain, the head of an ox, a star for the heavens and the gods. This first writing simply drew the world in miniature, one small sign at a time. Soon the scribes found a faster way. Instead of scratching curved pictures, they pressed the end of a cut reed into the clay, leaving small wedge-shaped marks. Combined and arranged, these wedges could stand for anything the pictures once showed. We call this writing cuneiform, from a word meaning wedge, and it would serve the peoples of Mesopotamia for 3,000 years. Then came the deepest magic of all. The signs began to stand not just for things but for sounds, so that a scribe could write a name, an action, a spoken word, anything the tongue could say. Now the marks in the clay could hold a command, a letter, a story, a prayer. Human speech, once vanishing the instant it was uttered, could be caught and kept forever. To master this art took long years of learning, and so there arose the tablet house, the school the Sumerians called the Adaba. Here boys sat with lumps of soft clay, copying signs again and again under a stern teacher's eye, learning the hundreds of marks by heart. It was hard, patient work, and the scribe who finished it held a rare and precious skill, honored above almost any other. And so memory became permanent. What one person knew could now outlive them, pressed into humble clay and left for those not yet born. A debt, a law, a king's deed, a poem, could travel across the centuries untouched by death. On this quiet plain of mud and reed, humankind had learned to speak across time itself, and nothing would ever be forgotten in quite the same way again. Long after the first tablets were pressed, the people of Uruk still told of a king who had ruled them in the deep past. His name was Gilgamesh, and in the telling he grew larger than any man, part mortal and part god. Around 4,500 years ago, he walked the city's walls, and those walls, they said, were his gift and his glory. Time has softened the truth of him into legend, and legend is a gentler thing to fall asleep inside. He was a restless king, too strong and too proud, and at first his people wearied of him. He drove the young men hard and gave the city no peace. So the gods, hearing their quiet complaints, decided to make him an equal, someone who could meet his strength and calm his heart. Out on the wild grasslands, they shaped a second man from clay and water. They called him Enkidu, and he was born among the animals, running with the gazelles and drinking at their watering holes. His hair was long, his body wild, and he knew nothing of cities or bread or the ways of men. For a time he lived as the creatures lived, under open sky, untroubled and free. He was the wilderness given a human shape. Little by little Enkidu was drawn toward the world of people, learning to eat their food and drink their barley beer, learning to wear cloth and sleep beneath a roof. When at last he came to Uruk, he and Gilgamesh met like two storms. They wrestled in the streets, straining and heaving, until the ground seemed to shake beneath them. And when it was over, neither had truly lost. They rose and they laughed, and they became as brothers. Together they were happier than either had been alone. They set out for the great cedar forest far to the north, seeking to make a name that would outlast them. There, among trees taller than any in the flat riverland, they faced its fearsome guardian and did not turn back. It is the kind of adventure that fills a young heart, the kind we half remember from stories told to us as children. But no joy in these old tales lasts unbroken. Enkidu fell ill, and no strength of his friend could hold him back from death. He faded slowly, speaking of dreams and shadows, and then he was gone. And Gilgamesh, who had feared nothing, sat beside him in a grief so heavy he could not rise. For the first time, the great king understood that he, too, would one day die. He could not bear it. He left his city and his crown and wandered out into the wilderness, dressed in skins, his hair grown wild like Enkidu's had once been. He was looking for something no one had ever found, a way to live forever, a way to escape the ending that waits for everyone. Across mountains and empty places he searched, driven by his sorrow, refusing to accept what he had learned. At the edge of the world he found an old man named Utnapishtim, the only mortal the gods had ever made deathless. And this old man told him a story older than Uruk itself. Long ago the gods had sent a great flood to cover the earth, and one man was warned in time to build a vast boat. He carried his family and the animals through the rising waters, and when the rain stopped, he sent out a bird to search for dry land. It is a story you may know in other forms, told by other peoples in later ages, but here it is, pressed into clay 1,000 years before those other tellings. Utnapishtim had survived the flood and been granted endless life, but that was a gift the gods would not give twice. He offered Gilgamesh one small chance, a plant that grew at the bottom of the sea, but even that slipped away, taken by a serpent while the king slept. So Gilgamesh went home. He climbed the walls of Uruk once more and looked out over the city he had built, the brick and the temples and the crowded streets. He understood at last that this was his immortality, not endless breath, but the things he left behind, the walls that would stand, the story that would be told. And that, in the end, is enough. Rest now as he learned to rest. Uruk was the first, but it was never the only one. Across the southern plain, over many centuries, other cities rose from the mud, each one a small world of its own. This land was called Sumer, and its people were the Sumerians, the first city builders the earth had known. Picture them scattered across the flatland like lamps in the dusk, each burning with its own light. There was Ur near the mouth of the rivers, with its harbors and its wealth. There was Kish to the north, and Lagash with its fields, and Nippur holy to them all. And there was Eridu, which the Sumerians believed to be the oldest place of all, the first city ever set down by the gods at the beginning of the world. Each name was a place where people had gathered and stayed and made a life. Every city belonged, in the minds of its people, to a god. Ur was the moon god's city, Nippur the home of Enlil, lord of the air, and each temple was thought of as that god's own house upon the earth. The people were the god's servants and tenants, working the fields that were, in a sense, the god's estate. To live in a city was to live in the household of a divine landlord. At the heart of each city rose the ziggurat, a great step tower of mud brick climbing toward the sky. It was not a place for crowds to worship inside, but a mountain made by human hands, a stair for the god to descend and a high place to draw near the heavens. From far across the flat plain a traveler could see it, catching the last light of the sun, and know that a city lay ahead. Below the temple spread the city itself, a maze of narrow lanes and flat-roofed houses pressed close together. Workshops rang with the sound of the potter and the smith. Merchants weighed silver and counted grain. In courtyards, families cooked and talked and slept, and the smell of baking bread drifted over the walls. It was crowded and loud and wholly alive, and it was new to the world. To rule each city there came to be a king called the Lugal, which meant simply the big man. In the earliest days he may have been a war leader chosen in danger, then kept on when the danger passed. Over time the office hardened into something permanent, handed from father to son, a crown that stayed within a family. He ruled, but always beneath the god, as the god's steward on earth. The king's task was to keep the gods content and the city safe. He mended the temples and dug the canals and led the men out when war came. He kept the great festivals and made the offerings, standing between his people and powers they could not see. Upon his righteousness, they believed, hung the harvest and the peace, and so his burden was heavy. No single city ruled the others for long. Instead they rose and fell in turn, one growing strong for a lifetime or two, then giving way to another. There was no single Sumerian nation, only this patchwork of proud, jealous, independent towns, bound by a shared language and shared gods, divided by everything else. They were kin who did not always love one another. And yet they shared so much. The same wedge-shaped writing, the same tales of gods and floods, the same ways of counting time by 60s that we still keep in our hours and minutes. A merchant of Ur could speak with a scribe of Kish and be understood. They were one people scattered among many cities, and that division in time would cost them dearly. For all their shared gods and shared words, the cities of Sumer did not live in peace. The plain was flat and rich, but its wealth was uneven, and where one city's fields ended, another's began. Boundaries were only lines drawn in the dust, easy to argue over, easy to cross. And so, almost as soon as there were cities, there was war between them. The oldest quarrel we can still read about was between two neighbors, Lagash and Umma. Between them lay a strip of good farmland and the water that fed it, and both cities claimed it as their own. For generations the dispute simmered, settled and then reopened, a wound that would not close. It began, as so many wars do, over a field and a channel of water. Water was life on that plain, and to hold the canal was to hold the harvest. A city upstream could open or close the flow, and a city downstream could wither or drown at its neighbor's will. So the border between Lagash and Umma was not only a line of soil but a line of thirst. Men would fight and die for the right to a ditch. There came a king of Lagash named Eanadam, and under him the long quarrel turned to open war. He gathered the men of his city into ranks, gave them spears and shields, and marched them out across the disputed ground. They moved together in a tight wall, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, one of the first armies the world had ever seen drawn up in order. We know of this because of a carved stone, worn now and broken, that once told the tale in pictures and words. It shows the soldiers advancing in a solid block, spears leveled, marching over the fallen. Above them will the birds, waiting. It is the earliest record we have of a war, pressed into stone nearly 4,500 years ago, so old that the men in it have no faces left. Yenadam won his war, and Lagash held the land. The story tells us he was wounded in the fighting, struck by an arrow, yet he did not fall. When it was over, the defeated city of Umma was made to swear great oaths before the gods, promising to keep the border and never again cross it. This may be the first peace treaty in all of history, a promise carved to outlast the men who made it. But promises made in defeat do not always hold. In time Umma rose again, the old grievance stirred, and the border was crossed once more. The stones were pulled up, the oaths forgotten, the canals fought over anew. Each generation seemed to inherit the anger of the last, and the field changed hands as the years turned, watered as much by quarrel as by rain. This is the shadow that fell across the bright achievement of the cities. The same people who invented writing and law and the plow also invented the marching army and the walled defense. Their high brick walls were raised not only against the flood but against each other. Progress and peril grew together, side by side, out of the same fertile mud. And when the fighting was done, the plain fell quiet again. The dust settled over the trampled field. Widows tended the barley, and the canals were mended, and children who had not seen the war grew up beside the same contested water. The cities endured, weary and proud, and the great rivers flowed on, indifferent, toward the sea. Let that quiet settle over you now. Turn now from kings and wars to something smaller and closer to the ground. Imagine a single farmer in a single village 4,000 years ago, and let his year unfold slowly before you. His world is not the temple or the throne, but a patch of barley, a house of mud brick, and the canal that runs past his door. In that small world there is a whole life. The year begins in autumn, when the great heat breaks and the soil can be worked again. He walks out to his field in the cool of the morning, his ox beside him, and guides the wooden plow through the earth. Behind the plow, a narrow funnel drops the seed into the furrow, grain by grain, so that nothing is wasted. The dark soil turns over, damp and rich, and the smell of it rises around him. Everything depends on water, and water must be led by hand. He tends the small channels that branch from the canal, opening a gap of mud to let the flow spread across his field, closing it again when the earth has drunk enough. It is patient work, done with a hoe and bare feet in the wet ground. The river's gift does not come freely. It must be coaxed, day after day, into the roots of the grain. Through the short, cool winter the barley grows green and thickens, and there is a little rest. He mends his tools and his roof, twists new rope from reeds, and sits in the evening while his wife grinds grain between two stones. Their house is simple. A few rooms of mud brick around a small open court, a hearth, some mats and pots, the animals close by. It is enough. It holds everything they love. In spring the field turns gold, and the harvest comes. The whole household goes out together, and neighbors too, cutting the barley with sickles of clay and wood, binding it into sheaves under the climbing sun. It is hard, hot work, and it must be done quickly before the grain is lost. But there is a gladness in it, the deep relief of a year's labor coming safely home. The cut barley is carried to the threshing floor, where oxen tread it and the grain is beaten free of the straw. Then it is tossed into the air, and the breeze carries off the light chaff and lets the heavy grain fall back down. What remains is measured and divided, a share for the temple, a share for seed, and a share to live on. The rest is carried home and stored against the long dry months. From the barley comes bread, and from the barley comes beer, and the beer is the drink of everyone in Sumer. It is thick and cloudy, mild and nourishing, sipped through a reed straw from a shared clay jar. At the end of the day, the family gathers around it, passing the straw, the children fed, the animals settled. The taste is a little sour and a little sweet, and it means the day's work is done. On certain mornings he walks to the town market, carrying grain or a jar of oil to trade. There is no coined money yet. Things are weighed against each other, or against small measures of silver and barley. He trades for a copper blade, for wool, for salt, for a fired pot to replace a broken one. Voices rise and fall around him, familiar faces, old bargains, the slow, comfortable haggling of people who have known each other all their lives. The children grow up in the fields and the lanes, learning by watching. A boy learns the plow and the canal from his father. A girl learns to spin and grind and brew from her mother. Only a few, the sons of the well-off, are sent to the tablet house to learn the difficult art of writing. Most will live and die within a walk of the house where they were born, and that is not a sorrow to them, but simply the shape of a life. And every day ends the same gentle way. The sun sinks red into the dust, the heat loosens its hold, and the family climbs to the flat roof to sleep in the moving air. Below them the canal shines faintly, and the barley whispers, and somewhere a dog settles into quiet. The stars come out over the plain, thick and close, the same stars their grandparents knew. Sleep comes easily to tired and honest bodies. The people of Sumer lived among their gods as among neighbors powerful and near. Every force of their world had a face and a name. The sky, the air, the water, the storm, the sun and the moon, the grain and the flocks. There were hundreds of them, great and small, and together they were thought to run the whole machinery of the world. To live was to live inside their vast, watchful household. The greatest of them ruled the largest things. There was the high god of the sky, remote and ancient. There was Enlil of Nippur, lord of the wind and the air, whose word could bless or destroy. There was Enki of the sweet waters, wise and kindly, a friend to humankind. And there was Inanna, brilliant and fierce, goddess of love and of war, the morning and evening star. These gods were not distant and serene, but as changeable as the land itself. They could be generous, sending the flood in its season and the barley in its rows. They could be cruel, sending drought or plague, or a river that rose too high and swept the fields away. The people never quite knew where they stood, and so their faith was woven through with worry. And so worship was, above all, a matter of keeping the gods content. In the temple at the top of the ziggurat, the god was thought to dwell, and the god had to be cared for like an honored lord. Priests washed the divine image and dressed it in fine cloth. They set food and drink before it each day, meat and bread and beer, and took the offerings away again when the god had taken his invisible share. The ziggurat rose in great receding steps, terrace upon terrace, its sides sometimes planted with trees, a stairway climbing the sky. Only priests and the king might ascend to the small shrine at its summit. There, high above the flat brown plain, the sacred and the human were thought to meet, and prayers were carried up the last few steps into the presence of the god. Through the year the festivals came around, marking the turning seasons. The greatest was the new year in spring, when the god's image was carried out in procession and the whole city gave itself to celebration. There were songs and offerings, the beating of drums, the smell of roasting meat and incense drifting over the rooftops. For a few bright days the anxious bargain with heaven felt, for once, like joy. Yet beneath the festival lay always the same quiet fear. The gods owed them nothing and could not be commanded, only asked, only pleased, only appeased. A good harvest was a gift that might not come again. A flood or a defeat was a punishment whose reason no one could be sure of. So the people gave and prayed and watched the sky and hoped that they had given enough. This was the bargain at the heart of their world. Mortals and gods bound together, the one raising towers and offerings, the other holding the rain and the river in unseen hands. Out of that long unease grew their temples, their festivals, their poetry, and much of their law. Rest now beneath those old stars, in that ancient land, where the towers of brick still climb, in the mind's eye, toward a sky full of watchful and half-remembered gods. The great cities of Sumer had stood for 1,000 years, each ruled by its own king, each praying to its own god. But now the years carry us to a man who would gather them all into one hand. His name is Sargon, and the stories say he began with nothing at all. Listen, and let the plain grow quiet around him. The old tale tells that his mother was a priestess who could not keep him, and that she set him in a basket of reeds, sealed with pitch, and let the river carry him away. A gardener drawing water found the child and raised him as his own. Whether it happened so or not, the story clings to Sargon like river mud, a beginning humble enough to make his rise seem like the will of the gods. He grew up in the north, in a land the Sumerians called Akkad, and he came to serve as cupbearer to the king of the city of Kish. It was a trusted place, close to the throne, close enough to watch how power was held and how it could slip. Somewhere in those years, the cupbearer decided the cup was not enough. How he took the throne we do not fully know. The tablets speak only in fragments of a fall, of a rise, of a new king who called himself Sargon, which means something like the true king or the rightful king. He built himself a new capital and named it Akkad, a city so lost to us now that no spade has ever found it beneath the plain. From that vanished city he marched south into the heart of Sumer. One by one the old rival cities fell before him, Uruk and Uar and Lagash, their walls thrown down, their kings brought low. Where for centuries the cities had quarreled among themselves, now a single ruler stood over them all, the first the world had ever seen. They say he washed his weapons in the lower sea, the waters of the Persian Gulf, and turned his face toward the mountains in the north and the far cedar forests. His armies reached lands the Sumerians had only traded with in whispers. For the first time, one man could call the whole of the land between the rivers his own. He was careful with his conquest. He placed trusted men from Akkad as governors in the conquered cities, and he kept a standing body of soldiers who ate the boast records before him each day. Roads carried grain and messengers. The tongue of Akkad rose beside the older speech of Sumer. An empire is not only taken. It must be held patiently year upon year. And in the midst of all this power stands a quieter figure, his daughter. Her name was Enheduanna, and Sargon set her as high priestess of the moon god in the city of Uar, to bind the Old South to his new rule. There, by lamplight, she did something no one before her is known to have done. She wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna and signed them with her own name. Across all the tablets that came before, the scribes stayed silent, nameless copiers of accounts and prayers. Enheduanna spoke as herself of her joy and her exile and her devotion, and so she becomes the first author in all of history whose name we still know. A woman writing in the dark 4,300 years ago. Sargon ruled for many long years, and legend swelled around him until it was hard to see the man inside. Rebellions rose in his old age, the tablets hint, and the cities he had chained together strained against the chain. But he held them, and when he died he passed to his sons an inheritance no king had ever held before. The first empire had begun. An empire once made must be made again in every generation. Sargon's sons took the throne after him, and each in turn faced the same restless cities rising against the yoke. They put down the revolts and held the land together, but the ground beneath the empire was never quite still, like a river that seems calm and pulls hard underneath. Then came his grandson, Naram-Sin, and under him the empire reached its brightest noon. He marched farther than his grandfather ever had, into the highlands and against distant kings, and he crushed a great uprising of rebel cities that had risen all at once. In his hands the empire of Akkad seemed less a thing men had built than a thing the heavens had granted. He carved his victory in stone. On a tall pink slab, Naram-Sin climbs a mountainside above his soldiers, and upon his helmet he wears the horns that until then only gods were allowed to wear. He called himself king of the 4 quarters of the world, and more than that, he let himself be named a god of his own city, worshipped while he still drew breath. It was a claim no Mesopotamian king had ever dared. For as long as anyone could remember, kings had been the servants of the gods, humble stewards who fed the temples and begged for good harvests. Naram-Sin stepped over that line and stood among the gods themselves. And the plain, which forgets nothing, seemed to hold its breath. The priests and scribes of later ages could not forget it either. They wrote a long, sorrowful poem, The Curse of Akkad, and in it they told how Naram-Sin, in his pride, laid rough hands upon the great temple of the god Enlil in Nippur. For that offense, the poem says, the god turned his face away, and doom came down upon the city like a shadow crossing the sun. Whatever the gods intended, the earth itself seemed to turn against Akkad. In those very years, the rains grew thin and the fields cracked, a long drought settling over the north where the empire had its heart. Dust drifted across abandoned villages. The grain that fed the armies and the governors and the great city thinned, and no king's decree can command the sky to give water. And down from the eastern mountains came the Gudians, a hardy people the Sumerians described with dread, as if the hills themselves had risen and walked. They raided the weakened land in bands, cutting the roads, unsettling the fields, wearing away at an empire already thin and hungry. The great machine of Akkad, so carefully built, began to come apart at the joints. No single battle ended it. Akkad simply loosened and dissolved, its capital fading, its power draining back into the old cities from which Sargon had drawn it. A later scribe, looking back, asked a hard question of that once golden city: who was king? Who was not king? As if even the names had blown away like chaff on the plain. So the first empire passed after not much more than a century and a half, the way a lamp gutters and goes dark while the room stays warm a little longer. Yet nothing was truly lost. The idea of empire had been born, the memory of one land under one crown, and that memory would wait in the dust, patient, for the next king bold enough to reach for it. For a while the mountain raiders held sway, and the plain lay divided again into its old patchwork of cities. But the Gudians never truly ruled the land they troubled, and in time the cities gathered their strength and pushed them back into the hills. From the south, from the ancient city of Ur, a new power rose to gather the pieces, gently at first, then all at once. This founder was a king named Ur-Nammu, and the age he began we call the third dynasty of Ur, a little more than 4,000 years ago. He was no wild conqueror in the mold of Sargon. He came instead as a restorer, a mender of canals and walls and broken things, a king who spoke of setting the land in order after the long disorder of the raids. And Ur-Nammu did something whose echo still reaches us. He gathered the customs of his people and had them set down as written law, a list of wrongs and their remedies, so that a man might know before he acted what justice would ask of him. It is the oldest law code yet found, older by 3 centuries than the famous laws of Hammurabi that would come after. Its words are strikingly gentle for so hard an age. Where later kings would demand an eye for an eye, Uarnamu's law more often asked for payment in silver to set a wrong to rights. If a man did harm, he weighed out compensation. In its opening, the king promises that the orphan shall not be given over to the rich, nor the widow to the powerful, a promise 4,000 years old and still tender to read. And in the heart of his city, Uarnamu raised the thing for which he is best remembered. Upon the flat plain he built a mountain of brick, a great ziggurat for the moon god Nana, rising in broad terraces one set back above another, its base longer than the length of many houses. Its lowest stage still stands today, after 4,000 years of wind, the most complete of all the temple towers of Sumer. Imagine it new. Its face was hung with baked brick set in black pitch, its edges softened by the low light, 3 great staircases climbing to a gateway partway up, and above, a shrine where only the priests might go. From the flat country it could be seen for a great distance, a made mountain in a land that had no mountains, telling every traveler whose city this was and whose god watched over it. His son Shulgi took the throne after him and reigned for nearly half a century, and under him the kingdom of Uar reached its full flowering. He was a proud and restless king who boasted, in his hymns, that he could run a great distance between 2 cities and back in a single day, and that he had learned the scribe's art like any tablet house boy. He completed what his father began. Under Shulgi the land became a vast and careful machine of record. Every sheep, every sack of grain, every day of a laborer's work was counted and pressed into clay, and the sealed tablets flowed into great storehouses by the tens of thousands. He set common weights and measures, a shared calendar, a network of messengers and way stations, until the whole kingdom seemed bound together by fine threads of accounting. It is a strange thing to fall asleep upon all those clay receipts. Yet in them we hear the ordinary breath of a living kingdom, the flocks and the fields and the tired scribes closing their accounts at dusk. For a golden century, Uar stood at the center of the world, orderly and rich and sure of itself, its ziggurat catching the last light above the fields. But no golden century lasts. The kingdom of Uar was built on order, and order is a delicate thing. It depended on the canals flowing, the harvests coming in, the distant governors staying loyal, the messengers reaching every corner in time. When such a machine runs well, it seems it will run forever. But the threads that held it, fine as they were, could fray one by one, quietly, before anyone thought to look. Along the western edges of the land lived the Amorites, herders who moved with their flocks between the grazing grounds and the towns. For years they had drifted into the settled country, taking work, taking land, and the kings of Uar grew uneasy. They even raised a long wall in the north to keep the newcomers out, but a wall across open country is a hope more than a barrier, and the people came anyway. The last strong king of Uar was named Ibisin, and it was his sorrow to watch the kingdom loosen in his hands. Season by season the outer cities stopped sending their grain and their taxes. The governors began to rule as if for themselves. The web of accounts that Shulgi had woven so tightly came undone. thread after thread, until the writ of UR reached little farther than its own walls. Then the harvests failed, and the price of grain in the city climbed until it stood many times its old height. One of Ibisin's own officers, sent to gather grain, saw how the wind was blowing and set himself up as a rival ruler in the north. The king in his great city could only watch the horizon and count what little remained in the storehouses. And in the end, the blow came from the east, from Elam beyond the mountains, whose armies moved down against a city that could no longer defend itself. They came through the weakened land and into UR, and they took the king away captive into their highlands, and the age of UR's greatness ended. The moon god's city, that had ordered the world, fell quiet. The people of Sumer did not let that sorrow pass without a voice. Their scribes composed a long and aching poem, the lament for UR, and in it the city's own goddess weeps for her fallen home. She sings of empty streets where crowds once gathered, of the great gates standing open to the wind, of festivals silenced and doorways left dark. It is one of the oldest laments in all the world. The poem does not dwell on wounds. It grieves for gentler losses, the sheepfold given to the wind, the grain that did not come, the songs that stopped, the mother who cannot find her child in the smoke. It asks the god how long the storm will blow, and the question hangs there unanswered, the way grief always asks and waits. To read it now is to hear a city mourning itself across 4,000 years. Yet even here there is a kind of mercy in how the story goes. UR was not erased. The walls stood, the ziggurat kept its place against the sky, and within a lifetime people were living in the city again, rebuilding, planting, pressing new tablets into the clay. What ended was not the place but the crown, the great dominion, the golden certainty that UR would rule the plain forever. So the last of the old Sumerian empires slipped into memory, and with it, in a way, the age of Sumer itself. The Sumerian tongue would linger on in the temples and the tablet houses, a language of learning and prayer, the way a lamp is kept burning in a quiet room. But out on the plain a new people were rising, and a new city was gathering the future to itself. When UR fell, no single hand caught the land it dropped. The plain broke again into rival kingdoms, each ruled now by the descendants of those same Amorite herders who had once camped at the edges of the settled country. They had learned the ways of the cities, taken up the old gods and the old writing, and settled onto thrones. From herders on the margins, they had become kings at the center. For 2 centuries, these Amorite kingdoms rose and fell and quarreled among themselves, much as the old Sumerian cities had done long before. Isin and Larsa contended in the south. Mari flourished on the middle Euphrates. Eshnunna and Assur held the north. It was a crowded and restless age, a board with many players, and no one yet could see which small piece would one day sweep the rest away. Among all these places was a town of no great fame, sitting on the Euphrates in the middle of the plain. Its name meant something like the gate of the god, and we know it as Babylon. For most of its long history so far, it had been an ordinary settlement, changing hands, paying its taxes, raising its modest temple, giving no sign of the glory its name would one day carry. Picture it in those early days before the walls grew famous. Low mud brick houses crowded along the riverbank, the water sliding brown and steady past the quays, fishing boats and reed skiffs nosing in among the date palms. Dust in the streets, the smell of baking bread and river mud, children by the water's edge. A town like 100 others, giving no hint of what it would become. Around the time Ur was falling, a family of Amorite chiefs took control of Babylon and made themselves its kings. They were a modest dynasty at first, holding little more than the town and the fields close around it, hemmed in on every side by neighbors far stronger than themselves. For several generations they simply endured, keeping their small kingdom alive among the giants, waiting without knowing what they waited for. They were patient builders, these early kings of Babylon. They tended the canals that fed their fields, raised the walls a little higher, honored their city god Marduk, who was then a minor deity of no great renown. Slowly, quietly, without alarming their powerful neighbors, they gathered a little more land, a little more strength, the way a small stream gathers itself before it deepens into a river. The world around them was a dangerous one, full of ambitious kings watching for any weakness. To survive, the little kingdom of Babylon learned to bend, making alliances and breaking them, bowing to a stronger neighbor one year and slipping free the next. It was schooled in patience and in cunning, in the long game of survival, and such schooling is not wasted on the one who lives through it. For the plain had learned, across 2,000 years, that greatness does not always come to the loud or the swift. It had come to Sargon, the cupbearer of humble birth, and to Ur-Nammu, the mender of a broken land. Now it was gathering unseen in a dusty town on the Euphrates, waiting only for the right man to be born into the right hour. And in time, into that patient little kingdom, such a man was born. His name would be Hammurabi, and under him the gate of the god would rise from an ordinary town to the center of the world, and its laws would be carved in stone for every age to read. But that is a story for the next hour of our long night. For now, let the river slide by in the dark and rest. Nearly 4,000 years ago, a young man comes to the throne of Babylon. His name is Hammurabi, and at first his kingdom is small, only a strip of land along the river with a few dusty towns in its care. He is patient in a way that kings rarely are. He waits, and he watches, and he lets his rivals wear themselves thin while Babylon grows quietly stronger. For year after year, he tends his city as a farmer tends a field. He digs canals and repairs the walls. He stores the grain and hears the troubles of his people. The scribes keep his letters still, and in them he asks after ditches and boundary stones and the fair sharing of water. He is building something slowly, the way roots take hold before anyone sees the tree. Then, when his hair has begun to gray, Hammurabi moves. One by one, the great cities of the plain come under his hand. Larsa in the south, Mari on the middle river, the old towns of Sumer that had stood for 1,000 years. Where others struck early and burned out, he had waited, and now the whole land between the rivers answers to Babylon. For the first time in a long age, the plain is one kingdom under one king. The roads are safer than they have been in memory. A merchant may carry his goods from the marshes of the south to the hills of the north and expect to arrive. Yet Hammurabi knows that spears alone cannot hold a people together. Something firmer is needed, something a person can trust. So he turns to justice. In every city there are disputes over a field, a debt, a broken wall, a straying ox. In each place the customs differ, and a poor man never knows whether the ruling will fall kindly or hard. Hammurabi decides that his kingdom shall have one law, written plainly, the same in Babylon as in the smallest town at the edge of the desert. He gathers the old judgments, the sayings of earlier kings, the quiet wisdom of the courts, and he shapes them into a single code. Then he has it carved into a great pillar of black stone, taller than a man, smooth and dark and enduring. This is no scroll to be lost or burned. It is a monument, meant to stand in the open where all who pass may see that the law does not hide. At the top of the stele, above the rows of writing, a picture is carved into the stone. The king stands before a seated figure, and rays like fire rise from that figure's shoulders. This is Shamash, the sun god, lord of light and of judgment, who sees all things by day and lets nothing stay hidden. He hands the king the rod and the ring, the tokens of true measure and fair rule. The meaning is plain to anyone who looks. Hammurabi does not claim to have invented these laws himself. He receives them from the God who watches the whole earth, and he sets them down only as a faithful servant. In the words carved beneath, he says his purpose is that the strong may not oppress the weak, and that justice should shine over the land like the sun. The laws themselves are many, close to 300, ordered case by case. If a man does this, then this shall follow. They speak of fields and floods, of hired workers and their wages, of doctors and boatmen and builders, of marriage and debt and the keeping of oxen. It is a whole society caught in clay and stone, the ordinary tangles of ordinary lives. From this code comes a saying the world has never forgotten. An eye for an eye, a bone for a bone. To our ears it can sound harsh, and often it was. Yet in its own time it was also a kind of limit, a wall against endless revenge. The punishment could match the harm, but it could not run past it, and no feud could swallow a family whole. The law is not the same for all, and Hammurabi does not pretend it is. A noble, a commoner, and an enslaved person each stand in a different place before it, and the penalties shift with their standing. It is not justice as we would draw it now. Yet the idea beneath it is a seed that will grow for ages, the idea that rulers too must answer to a rule, and that even a king serves the law. Hammurabi rules for more than 40 years, and when he dies his stele still stands beneath the open sky. Long after his empire has crumbled, the black stone will be carried off, buried and forgotten, only to be lifted again from the earth in a far later age. The strong so often oppress the weak. Yet a king once stood in the sunlight and swore that they should not, and had it written in stone so the promise would outlast him. Let the great deeds rest a while, and come down into the streets. It is late afternoon in Babylon in the days of the lawgiver. The heat of the day is loosening its grip, and the light has turned the color of honey. Come and walk here slowly, with nowhere you need to be, and let the ordinary city gather softly around you. The streets are narrow and winding, packed earth between walls of sun-dried brick. The houses turn blank faces to the lane and open inward, onto small courtyards where the family lives. A child chases a dog past your feet. Somewhere a loom clacks in an even rhythm, and the smell of baking bread drifts out of a low doorway and follows you down the street. The lane opens toward the river, and there is the Euphrates, wide and brown and patient, moving through the heart of the city. Reed boats and wooden barges are tied along the quay. Men unload jars of oil and bundles of dates and stacks of firewood floated down from the north. The water throws back the low sun in long ribbons of light that shiver and rejoin. Along the quay the market spreads its noise and color. Baskets of barley and lentils, heaps of onions and garlic, dried fish, wool, and clay pots stacked in leaning towers. A woman weighs out silver on a small balance, for there are no coins yet, only weighed metal and honest scales. Voices haggle and laugh, and the day's last bargains are struck before the light goes. Under an awning nearby sits a scribe, cross-legged, a damp tablet of clay resting on his palm. Someone stands before him with a matter to record, a loan of grain, a marriage, the sale of a field. His reed presses the little wedge shapes into the soft clay, quick and sure. When he is done, the tablet will dry hard, and a spoken promise will become a thing you can hold. Above the rooftops rises the temple tower, the ziggurat, stepped like a mountain built by hands. It belongs to Marduk, the god of the city, whose star is climbing as Babylon climbs. At its foot, the temple has been busy all day, storing grain, lending seed, feeding the god and his servants. Now the courts fall quiet, and the last thread of incense unwinds into the cooling air. The workers are coming home. A potter washes the clay from his arms. A fisherman coils his net and carries his catch-up from the water. In the doorways women set out the evening meal, barley bread and a stew of beans, onions and a little fish, and a thick beer sipped slow through a reed. It is a plain supper, and it is enough, and it tastes of the end of the day. The sun settles behind the flat western plain, and the brick of the whole city glows for a moment, warm as an ember, then begins to cool. Lamps are lit within the courtyards, small clay dishes of oil with a floating wick, and one by one the little flames appear behind the walls. The great river turns from gold to gray to a dark and gentle silver. On the rooftops, where the air is coolest, families spread their mats to sleep beneath the open sky. Above them, the stars come out in their slow thousands, the same stars the priests have watched and named and tracked across the years. A child asks a sleepy question and is answered softly. The talk grows quieter. The city is letting go of the day. And so Babylon sleeps, as it has slept and will sleep for 1,000 years, held between the two rivers under the turning stars. The watchman walks his round. The river murmurs against the quay. Somewhere a dog settles, a door is barred, a last lamp is pinched out. Rest here a moment in that ancient quiet, before the years begin to move again. Every strong hand must one day loosen, and so it is with Babylon. When Hammurabi dies, his son takes the throne, and he is not a poor king, but he is not his father. The great kingdom his father gathered so patiently was held together as much by the man as by the throne, and without that steady hand the edges begin very slowly to come loose. In the far south the old Sumerian cities pull away, tired of paying and obeying a distant capital. In the marshes a rival dynasty rises and takes the coast. The tribute stops coming from the north. No single day marks the change. It is more like a tide going out, so gradual that no one standing on the shore can name the moment the water begins to leave. The kings who follow spend their strength holding on. They repair the walls, they put down revolts, they write the same anxious letters about canals and borders that their fathers wrote. But the reach grows shorter with each reign. Babylon is still a great city, still rich and proud on its river, yet the wide empire has shrunk back almost to the land around the walls. And beyond the familiar world, in the north and the west, new peoples are stirring. Among the hills of what we now call Turkey, a kingdom has grown strong and hungry, a people who have learned to fight from horse-drawn chariots and to work iron before their neighbors. They are the Hittites, and their king looks down the long river valleys toward the fat cities of the plain. Around the year 1595 BC, or near enough, the Hittite king Mursalai leads his army south. It is a bold and distant march, far from his own mountains, deep into a land his people have never held. They follow the Euphrates down out of the highlands, past the ruined towns and the standing ones, moving toward the greatest prize of all, the city of Hammurabi itself. Babylon is not ready. The strength that might once have met such an army in the field has drained away over the slow generations. The Hittites reach the walls, and the walls do not hold them long. For the first time in its proud history, the city is taken by a foreign king, and the gates that had kept the world out stand open to it. Let us not linger over that day. The soldiers take what an army takes. The temples are stripped of their treasures, and even the statue of Marduk, the god of the city, is carried away from his home, which to the people is a wound deeper than any wall thrown down. There is smoke, and there is loss, and there is the strange silence that comes after. But the Hittites do not stay. They have come too far from their own country to hold this place, and their king has troubles waiting behind him at home. So they turn and march north again with their plunder, leaving the great city stunned and leaderless behind them. They had come like a storm, and like a storm they pass, and the flooded land is left to find its own level again. Into that emptiness comes a quieter people. For some time the Kassites, a people from the eastern mountains, had been drifting down into Babylonia, first as workers and soldiers, then as neighbors, and now as lords. With the old dynasty gone and no strong hand to stop them, they take up the vacant throne almost gently, without a great war to mark it. And here is the wonder of the Kassites. These outsiders, these highland newcomers, do not tear down the world they have inherited. They fall in love with it. They learn its language and copy out its old stories. They honor Marduk and carry his statue home again. They keep the temples and the scribes and the ancient names. They rule as Babylonians more than as conquerors. Under the Kassites, Babylonia enters a long, calm age that lasts for centuries, longer than any dynasty before it. Few great battles are remembered. Few loud kings stride across the story. It is a quiet time, an age of steady farming and patient trade and careful copying of the old tablets. The kind of peace that leaves little noise in the records but lets a people simply live. So the first dynasty of Babylon ends, not in one great crash, but in a long fading and a gentle passing of the throne. The city itself endures. Hammurabi's laws are still copied by scribes who never knew him. The name of Babylon will rise and fall many times yet. But its first great age closes softly here, and the land settles into its long Kassite quiet. While the south dozes in its long Kassite peace, our story travels north up the Tigris into a harder country. Here the plain gives way to rolling hills and open ground. The winters bite colder, and the land has no marshes to hide in and few natural walls to shelter behind. This is the homeland of Assyria, and it will raise a very different kind of people. At the heart of it stands the city of Ashur, perched on a bluff above the Tigris where the river bends. It is an old place, older than Babylon's greatness, a town of merchants and priests clinging to its rock. From this single city, a whole nation will one day take its name, and a small trading town will slowly become the seed of the greatest empire the world has yet seen. The city bears the name of its god, and the god bears the name of the city, so closely are they bound. Ashur is his name, the Lord and guardian of the people, and to serve him is to serve the nation itself. Where Babylon looked to Marduk and the moon and the stars, Assyria looks to Ashur, stern and watchful, a god who walks with his armies and asks that his land be made ever wider. In these early days, before the spears and the empire, the men of Ashur are known first as traders. They send long caravans of donkeys far to the north and west, into the hill country of Anatolia, laden with tin and fine woven cloth. They come home with silver and gold. In distant towns, they build little colonies of Assyrian merchants, careful men who keep close accounts on clay. We know their names and their worries because their letters survive, dug up thousands of years later in a foreign land. A trader writes to his wife about the goods and the road. A wife writes back about the cloth she is weaving and the debts at home and how long he has been gone. Across 4,000 years, the small voices of ordinary lives still reach us, plain and human. But the very land that made them traders also made them fighters. Assyria sits open on every side, with no great rivers or mountains to guard it, ringed by restless peoples who could come raiding whenever the harvest was thin. A country like that must either grow strong or be swallowed. Year by year, hardship teaches the people of Ashur to hold a spear as readily as a ledger. And so a hard cast of mind takes root here, patient and unsentimental. The Assyrian learns that safety is never given, only taken and held. The frontier is not a line on a map, but the edge of a blade, to be pushed outward or pressed back. Out of this long unease grows a discipline, a toughness, a willingness to march far and endure much, that will one day terrify the whole ancient world. For a long while, though, Assyria is only one power among many, and often not the strongest. There are seasons when the merchants of Ashur bow to greater kings, when Babylon in the south or other lords in the west hold the upper hand. The city keeps its head down, pays what it must, and waits. Like Babylon before its rise, Assyria is learning the long patience that comes before power. Now and then a stronger king lifts the city for a time. One such is Shamshi-Adad, who in the days near Hammurabi builds a wide northern realm and calls himself a great king. But his kingdom, like so many, is held together by one man, and when he dies it comes apart. Assyria sinks back again, and the true rise is still centuries away, waiting for its hour. Yet through every rise and fall, the city of Ashur endures upon its rock. The temple of the god is rebuilt when it crumbles. The merchants send out their donkeys again when the roads are safe. The name is remembered, the god is served, the accounts are kept. A people is being slowly forged here, tempered by exposure the way iron is tempered by the fire and the hammer. Picture the city at dusk in one of those waiting centuries. The Tigris slides dark below the bluff. The last caravan of the day comes in through the gate, the donkeys weary, the drivers dusty and glad to be home. On the height, the temple of Ashur catches the last of the light. The god looks north and west over the open land, patient as his people have learned to be. For now Assyria only watches and grows and waits, a hard seed in hard ground. But the day is coming, still far off down the river of years, when this stern northern city will wake in its full strength and reach out across the whole known world. That is a story for later, for a darker and a mightier chapter. Tonight, let Ashur keep its long watch and rest. The plain is still, and the north wind carries the smell of dust and river mud. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Assyria wakes from a long sleep and begins to grow, city by city, road by road. Its kings no longer wish only to guard their frontier. They wish to hold the whole of the land between the rivers in their two hands. A king named Ashurnasirpal rises, patient and hard as the stone he loves. He gathers the northern towns beneath one crown, and where old walls have crumbled he raises new ones. Under him the kingdom stops, flinching at its borders. It leans outward instead, quietly, the way a shadow lengthens as the sun climbs. He builds himself a capital at Nimrud, on a bend of the Tigris where the water runs slow and brown. Workers haul brick and cedar. Canals are cut to bring cool water to the gardens. When at last the palace is finished, the king throws open its doors and feasts thousands for many days, and the lamps in the great halls burn late into the quiet. Later kings will make Nineveh the jewel of the north, greatest of all Assyrian cities. Its walls run for miles above the river, wide enough for chariots to pass along the top. Behind them lie temples, orchards, and streets crowded with traders speaking a dozen tongues. From its towers you can watch the Tigris turn silver, then gray, then dark. The strength of Assyria is its army, and it is unlike any the world has yet seen. The soldiers march in ordered ranks, drilled until each man moves like part of one great body. There are archers, spearmen, horsemen, and engineers who know how to cross rivers and break down gates. It is discipline more than fury that makes them feared. Season after season the army goes out, and the kings return with tribute heaped high. Gold and silver, timber and horses, strange beasts for the royal parks, and long lines of captured people led away to distant provinces. It is a hard age, and the empire is built on the fear it spreads. We let those shadows stay far off, at the edge of the lamplight. Along the palace walls the kings set carved slabs of pale stone, panel after panel, telling the story of their reign. Here a lion springs, here a river is crossed, here a city yields and its people file quietly away. The reliefs are cut so finely you can count the feathers on a bird, the fringe on a robe, the muscles beneath a horse's skin. Guarding the gateways stand the lamassu, great winged bulls with the calm bearded faces of men. They are carved with 5 legs, so that from the front they seem to stand still, and from the side they seem to stride forward forever. For 3,000 years those patient stone eyes have watched over the thresholds, and they watch still. In time there comes a king named Ashurbanipal, and he is a warrior like his fathers, but something more besides. He has been taught to read the old wedge-shaped writing, and he loves it. While other kings collect gold, he begins to collect words. He sends scribes across the land to copy every tablet they can find. At Nineveh he gathers them into a great library, room upon room of clay tablets stacked and ordered like loaves in a baker's shop. Stories, prayers, and star charts. Medicine, law, and long lists of words. The tale of Gilgamesh and the tale of the flood. It is the memory of Mesopotamia, 2,000 years of thought, gathered under one roof. The tablets are only baked clay, humble and plain, the same mud the first farmers once shaped into pots. Yet clay, once fired, endures. Stone crumbles and cedar rots and gold is carried off, but a baked tablet can lie in the dark for ages and still be read. Ashurbanipal, without knowing it, is saving his world for us. So this is Assyria at its height. The marching army on the roads, the carved lions on the walls, the winged bulls at the gates, and the quiet library where a king hoards words like treasure. It seems in those years that nothing could ever pull it down. But empires, like the day, are brightest just before the light begins to fail. An empire this large is heavier than it looks. Its borders stretch from the mountains to the sea, and every mile must be guarded, every conquered land held down by force. The armies that go out each year grow tired. The provinces that pay tribute grow resentful. Beneath the gleaming palaces, the whole vast weight begins, very slowly, to strain. For generations Assyria has ruled by fear, and fear is a debt that must one day be repaid. In the mountains to the east live the Medes, a fierce and rising people. To the south, Babylon has never forgotten its own long glory and chafes beneath the northern yoke. Each waits, watching, for the moment the giant stumbles. When the great collector king Ashurbanipal dies, the moment comes. His sons quarrel over the throne, and civil war spreads through the heartland like a crack through a clay pot. Brother turns against brother. The army is divided against itself. While Assyria fights its own shadow, its enemies quietly sharpen their spears. In the south, a new king takes Babylon and refuses any longer to bow. His name is Nabopolassar, and he declares the old city free. In the eastern hills, the king of the Medes gathers his horsemen. Then the two of them, so long kept apart by Assyrian power, do the one thing Assyria always feared. They join hands. Together their armies turn north, up the rivers, toward the heart of the empire. One by one, the proud Assyrian cities are surrounded. The great fortress of Ashur, the ancient home of the god himself, is taken and its temples fall silent. Still the allies press on, for one prize remains, the greatest of them all. In the year we call 612 BC, they come at last to Nineveh, that vast city on the Tigris, ringed by its miles of mighty wall. For weeks the siege holds. Then, the old stories say, the river itself rises in flood and tears a breach in the defenses. Through the gap the waters and the armies pour, and the long night of Nineveh begins. The city that had gathered the tribute of the world is emptied in a matter of days. The palaces burn, and their carved stone lions crack in the heat. The great library, its tablets tumbled from the shelves, is buried beneath the falling roofs. And there, in the dark and the ash, those baked clay words wait, safer broken and buried than they ever were on their shelves. When the fires die, a strange quiet settles over the ruins. The streets that held 100,000 souls stand empty. The wind moves through open halls where kings once feasted. Grass finds the cracks between the stones. The mightiest empire the world had yet known is simply gone, so completely that later travelers will pass the mounds and never guess a city sleeps beneath. It happened so swiftly that far-off peoples could scarcely believe it. For 100 years Assyria had made the nations tremble, and then in a single generation it was as though it had never been. Distant writers spoke of it with wonder, that so great a power could vanish like breath on a cold morning, leaving only shattered walls behind. Yet nothing truly vanishes in the land between the rivers. The roads the Assyrians cut remain. Their way of ruling many peoples under one law passes to those who come after. And the buried library will one day be found, and its old stories will speak again, so that Nineveh's greatest king is remembered not for his armies, but for the words he saved. So the north falls silent, and the balance of the world tips southward once more. The city that rises now to take Assyria's place is Babylon, old and patient, freed at last. Its new king dreams of a splendor to outshine all that came before. Rest a moment here, in the hush after the fall, and let the story carry you gently down the river toward it. Babylon is very old already when its last great age begins. It has stood beside the Euphrates for well over 1,000 years, since the days of Hammurabi and his laws of stone. Now, with Assyria fallen, it wakes to a second morning. And to the throne comes a king whose name still echoes across the ages, Nebuchadnezzar. He is the son of Nabopolassar, the king who broke Assyria, and he inherits both an army and a dream. He wishes to make Babylon not merely great, but the wonder of the whole earth, a city so beautiful that travelers will speak of it for 1,000 years. And for once, a king's boast will very nearly come true. He rebuilds the city on a scale that staggers the eye. The Euphrates runs straight through its heart, and bridges cross it. On either bank rise temples, palaces, and streets laid out in careful order. A double ring of walls encircles it all, so broad, the old writers claimed, that a chariot could turn upon their top. Within them live tens of thousands, safe behind the brick. Through the northern wall opens the Ishtar Gate, and it is a thing of quiet marvel. Its bricks are glazed a deep and glowing blue, the color of the sky just after sunset, and against that blue march rows of golden bulls and dragons. To pass beneath it is to walk into a jewel. Even now, its blue tiles shine in museums, and children stop to stare. From the gate runs the great processional way, a broad avenue paved with stone, its walls lined with glazed lions striding beside the traveler. On festival days, the image of the god Marduk is carried along it in solemn procession, with music and lamplight and the smell of incense on the evening air. the whole city turns out to walk beneath the blue. At the center rises the ziggurat, the temple tower called Edamananki, whose name means the foundation of heaven and earth. Terrace upon terrace it climbs, brick upon brick, a great stairway reaching toward the sky. It is so tall and so famous that distant peoples remember it in their own tales, and long after, it will be recalled as the Tower of Babel. And somewhere in the royal quarter, the old stories tell of gardens that seem to hang in the air. Terrace above terrace, green with trees and trailing vines, watered by hidden channels lifted from the river below. They say a king built them for a queen who missed the green hills of her mountain home, so that even in the flat and dusty plain she might climb into a garden in the sky. Whether the hanging gardens truly stood as the tales describe, no one now can say for certain. No wall of them has yet been found. But the story has never faded, this dream of leaves and falling water raised against the heat of Babylon. Some wonders live on not in stone but in the telling, passed from mouth to mouth across the centuries. Yet a great empire is built on more than beauty, and Nebuchadnezzar's armies march far. In the west lies the small kingdom of Judah, with its city of Jerusalem, and when it defies him, he besieges it and takes it. The city's walls are pulled down, and its temple falls, and this is a sorrow that will be remembered for a very long time. Many of the people of Judah are led away eastward, along the dusty roads, to live beside the rivers of Babylon. Far from the hills of home, they sit by the water and remember, and their longing turns into songs and writings that endure to this day. We hold their grief gently, the way one holds anything fragile in the dark, and wish them, across the ages, a safe road home. And in time a road home does open, though that is a story still to come. For now the exiles live and labor in the shadow of the great walls, keeping their memory alive in words, as their captors keep theirs in clay. Both, in their way, are writing so that they will not be forgotten. Both, in their way, will be heard again. So Babylon shines, blue-gated and gold-figured, the last great flowering of the land between the rivers. Its walls seem eternal, its tower touches the clouds, its king the master of the world. But Nebuchadnezzar grows old, and the kings who follow him are lesser men. The lamps still burn along the processional way, but the long day of Mesopotamia is drawing softly toward its evening. After Nebuchadnezzar, the throne of Babylon passes quickly from hand to hand, and the great city begins to lose its footing. At last it comes to a king named Nabonidus, a thoughtful and unusual man, more drawn to old temples and older gods than to the daily business of ruling. He loves the moon god above all, and this troubles the priests of Marduk. For years Nabonidus leaves Babylon altogether, dwelling far away in a desert oasis, tending to shrines and studying the past. In his absence, he sets his son upon the throne to rule in his place. The son's name is Belshazzar, and it is he who holds the city while his father dreams among the ruins of forgotten cities to the south. Meanwhile, far to the east, A new power is rising, swift and bright. A Persian king named Cyrus has united the peoples of the highlands and swept from victory to victory. Kingdom after kingdom falls to him, not always by the sword, for he has a gift rare among conquerors. He lets the peoples he takes keep their gods, their customs, and their homes. The old stories tell of a night in Babylon, a great feast in the lighted halls while Belshazzar rules. And in the midst of the feasting, they say, a hand appears and writes strange words upon the plaster of the wall, words that no one at the table can read. It is an image that has never left us, the warning that comes quietly in the middle of the celebration. A wise man is called, and he reads the writing, and its meaning is grave. Your days, it says, have been counted, and your kingdom is weighed in the balance and found wanting, and it will be given to another. The lamps burn on, the guests fall silent, and outside the mighty walls the night is very still. Whatever truly happened, the tale remembers a kingdom whose time had come. For the Persians are already near. Cyrus has turned his armies toward Babylon, and the great city, for all its walls, is weary and divided within. Its priests are unhappy. Its people are tired of kings who neglect the old gods. When a conqueror comes who promises to honor Marduk and restore the temples, many hearts within the walls are already half-turned toward him. And so, in the year we call 539 BC, Babylon falls almost without a battle. The stories say the Persians turned aside the river and walked in along its dry bed, entering the city while its defenders scarcely knew. However it was done, the greatest walls in the world are opened, and Cyrus enters as much welcomed as feared. There is no long siege, no burning. The city simply changes hands. Cyrus is careful and wise in his victory. He does not tear down Babylon or scatter its people. He honors Marduk in the god's own temple, keeps the city whole, and lets its life go on much as before. And he permits the exiles who long for distant homes to return to them at last, so that the people of Judah may take the long road back to Jerusalem. But for the land between the rivers, something quiet and final has happened. For 3,000 years, kings of this soil had ruled this soil, from the first lords of Uruk to the last kings of Babylon. Now the land belongs to a power born beyond the mountains. The cities remain, the temples remain, the rivers run on as ever, but the crown has passed away, and it will not return. Babylon does not vanish the way Nineveh did. For long ages it lives on, a great city under Persians and then Greeks and others still, its towers slowly crumbling, its bricks carried off one by one. But its independence is over, and with it ends the age of the native empires, the long story that began in the mud with the first small walls of the first small towns. And so the land between the rivers lays its kingship down and passes into a longer, quieter history. The plain that gave the world its first cities, its first writing, its first laws and gardens and gods, now settles beneath the dust like a lamp gently lowered at the end of the day. Rest now. The rivers are still flowing. They have never once stopped. The cities are silent now. The two rivers still run, though they have wandered from their old beds, and the great towers of brick have melted slowly back into the plain, until they are only low green hills of earth the people call tells. For long centuries, no one remembered what lay beneath them. The names of the kings were lost. The old gods were forgotten. The wedge-shaped writing dwindled into marks that no living person on earth could any longer read. And yet, almost everything we are began here. When you tell the time and an hour holds 60 minutes, and a minute holds 60 seconds, you are counting in the way the Sumerians counted out on this plain 4,000 years ago. When you read a line of writing, you are the distant air of a scribe pressing a reed into wet clay by lamplight in the temple of Uruk. When a court sits and weighs what is just, it echoes faintly, a black stone standing in the Babylonian sun. The wheel and the plow, the written contract, the map, the school, the long poem, the walled and crowded city. All of them were first turned over in human hands here, in the dust between the rivers, and then handed onward, quietly, to everyone who came after. The clay remembered what the people forgot. Buried in the ruins, baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the cities, hundreds of thousands of tablets lay waiting in the dark, and slowly, over the last 2 centuries, patient hands have begun to lift them out and read them once again. So the oldest voices in the world are speaking to us once more. A king's proud boast, a merchant's dull receipt, a child's clumsy spelling lesson, and a lullaby a mother once hummed beside a river that is still flowing softly tonight. Let their voices carry you down into sleep now. The lamp is low. The land between the 2 rivers is at peace, and its long, long story is safe. Rest well. And whenever you are ready for it, another quiet story will be waiting here for you, in the dark.